Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we gather here to debate on the motion this House believes that a parliamentary democracy requires the inclusion of sovereign referenda to decide on important issues. Parliamentary democracy is a democratic form of government in which the party or a coalition of parties with the greatest representation in the parliament forms the government. A referendum is a direct vote in which the entire electorate is asked to either accept or reject a particular proposal, usually a piece of legislation which has been passed into the law by the local legislative body and signed by the pertinent executive official. Referendums are a way to express the freedom of choice and a form of direct democracy. Important issues are the issues that target the sovereignty, that target the state and all citizens, like constitutional changes, international treaties, and supranational organizations. The first two arguments will be presented by me, and the third argument will be presented by the second speaker. Our first argument is the power of democracy. This argument will be divided into two parts, from which the first one states that the referendum gives freedom of choice. Referendums are a way to strengthen democracy by giving the people one of the basic human rights, the ability to decide and to have choice. On this way, citizens may express their opinion directly, rather by politicians or their interpretation of their views, which often are manipulated. Have shown manipulation.
But if their views are so manipulated, then why are we giving them more power to make decisions?
We are not giving them power. We give power to the citizens by referendum to express their wishes. Also, referendums can embody the common notion of people rule, and people's wills will become the final the final arbitration of any serious and publicly concerned debates. Referendums allow every voter to express their views directly and clearly. They can contemplate the concerning motions and take part in policy making actively and responsibly. They can referendums complement, but they do not replace representative democracy. As a standing mechanism, but not frequently activated, they can help to remind governments and parliaments of the country of the centrality of their people. They are the easiest way of getting the citizens' voice heard. And when all the parties want the opposite. No thank you. Without referendums, people won't have any choice on the issue. In this case, the issue is immigration. Without referendums, people don't have choice on the issue. In this case, for over 50 years, governments from both the left and the right have permitted large-scale immigration despite constant opposition from their citizens. The system has failed democracy in this case, and the only way to restore the democratic rights of the people of the Britain is by having a referendum on this matter. The second part of our argument is education and interest. There are also examples showing us that referendums contribute to increasing political interest and making citizens more aware and knowledgeable about political issues. Referendums enable citizens to express an opinion on a specific way, and in this way can give difficult decisions extra legitimacy. There's a contradiction between the assumption that as electors, ordinary people can there is a contradictory between the assumption that as electors, ordinary people are competent to choose between different parties and party programs, and the assumption that some people are not competent to participate in decision-making on political issues. Political incompetence is no cause for excluding citizens from the political decision-making on issues. In reality, it's the other way around. Political incompetence is an effect of the exclusion of the citizens from the political system. And eventually, it comes down to the question whether all the citizens are educated enough to know how to make the right choice, or are there any manipulations in the referendum process. For starters, there are always different approaches to the provision of non-partisan information. In many U.S. states, the state government is responsible for publishing an information pamphlet. Thank you. pamphlet, which many voters cite as their prime source of information is reaching on decision how to vote. The pamphlet usually contains an article from yes and no campaign, but crucially also contains an independent analysis of the proposition by the government. In other countries, the government information department run information campaigns, such as distributing leaflets or running broadcasts. In Ireland, the Independent Referendum Commission is responsible for running an information campaign that explains the subject of the referendum and sets out arguments for and against the referendum proposal. For commissions, it's required to disseminate the information as widely as possible and promote and facilitate debate at the referendum. At 1992 Australian referendum on the monarchy, the government established an expert group to direct a neutral public education campaign, giving the group a substantial budget in order to fund its operation. If the government does agree to fund a non-partisan information campaign, there are various different mediums through which the campaign could be run. In many countries, an information booklet is delivered to every household or registered voter. In others, television and radio broadcasts might be used. The second argument states, yes?
Okay, oftentimes these radio or these like news sources can be swayed by things like propaganda and these sort of headlines. How can you say that people are going to be qualified to vote with things like this?
Because that way they can get educated about the problem. The second argument states uniting the parties. The supporters of the use of referendums argue that the context of increasing voter apathy in disenchantment with traditional forms of democracy, direct democracy can help to re-engage voters with politics and democracy. Another argument advanced in favor of referendum is that they can be used to resolve political problems, particularly for incumbent government where a governing party is divided over an issue. For example, holding a referendum can help reach a solution on the issue without splitting the party. Example of this are the 1975 UK referendum on whether UK should remain in the EEC, over which the ruling Labour government was deeply divided, and Sweden's 1980 referendum on nuclear power, where parties in the government's coalition supported different options. Some are the view that referendums function as a safety value. When the parties operating in the representative democracy, in the representative system, are exclusively divided either internationally or among themselves. It may then be difficult for the government to find a solid basis with dealing with a certain issue. And in this situation, a solution might be to consult the electorate in a referendum or on the issue in question. Thank you.
On side opposition, we actually think that dispute and talks and discussion within democracies and within governments is actually a good thing because we think that promotes discussion. But what we don't think is that when we recognize that people are so easily manipulated, that we should be giving them more power. We think that there's a balance of power that should be given to people, and we think that's satisfied by giving them elections. We think that giving them the power to change the Constitution, to change treaties, and to change supranational bodies is too much. So let's get into some clash with what we heard from side proposition, and then we'll move into our arguments. I'll be bringing up the first two, which are about how politicians are more qualified to make decisions. Our second one is going to be about the beauty of democracy, and thirdly, we're going to come up, and my partner's going to talk about the involvement of people, and he's going to talk about voter turnout. So firstly, they came up here and they talked about constitutional treaties and supranational issues are going to be all up for referendum. What we think is that this is actually problematic in the real world. So for example, we see that when Greece doesn't want to accept bailout packages from the EU, they might elect to leave. We think that that's problematic not only for Greece leaving, like we think it's going to be very detrimental for them, but furthermore we think it's detrimental to the EU as a whole. We think that solidarity is absolutely important. We think that we can't be putting those kind of decisions into the hands of people who don't have the expertise in the area. Furthermore, they came up here and talked to us and they conceded that people are manipulated. And so what we say is, then why do we give them more power? Then they came up here and said that we can create nonpartisan pamphlets and nonpartisan education campaigns. What we see is that we don't believe that these are going to be completely unbiased. We think that there is going to be a sway or an increased amount of information on one side. We don't think that there's a possibility of a completely fair information pamphlet. Furthermore, we think that it's absolutely impossible when the government who's in control is the one funding them. We think that that is problematic as far as like incentives. Furthermore, we say that if like nonpartisan information campaigns can't force this education upon voters, and we think that that's problematic, that people who don't want to receive the education, don't want to be educated, still have the right to vote on these issues. Furthermore, they came up here and they talked to us, and they gave us the example of immigration policies. And they talked to us about how people don't want people to be immigrating into their country, yet the governments continue to do that. We think this is a perfectly legitimate example of why sometimes the government knows best. Firstly, we think that like not wanting immigration is generally a sign of xenophobia, and we think that's wrong. Furthermore, we say that immigration grows the economy and benefits the country within it. Secondly, we say that on a humanitarian basis, people who want to immigrate into your country to make a better life for themselves definitely should. That's why governments continue to do that, even though their xenophobic population decides they don't want it. So now we think that we've effectively dealt with the contentions brought up on side proposition, and we want to move into our case. And our first pillar is about how politicians are more qualified to make decisions. So, what we think that the purpose of government is to make the best decision for the people. Democracy is merely one form of government which aims to achieve this goal. Unfortunately, the best decisions aren't always the popular ones, which is where the theory of sovereign referenda falls apart. If we can agree that the ultimate goal of government is to make the best decisions, then the notion of sovereign referenda must be opposed. When people vote in a sovereign referendum, their votes may not be in the best interest of the nation. There are 4 reasons for this. Firstly, self-interest. Secondly, uninformed opinions. Thirdly, misinformed opinions. And fourthly, accountability. Let's get into them. Self-interest. We say that individuals will vote based on what they perceive as most beneficial to themselves. We say that this isn't wrong, it just isn't useful in certain contexts, like policy making. An example of this, no thank you, where this applies to the referenda was the Icelandic banking referendum. The collapse of Iceland's bank asked if the investors should be reimbursed. The Icelandic people voted no, simply because it was in their self-interest not to pay money to overseas investors. Unfortunately, this effective default generated huge negative economic repercussions, not only in Iceland, but in Europe, because these investors lost 4 billion euros. We think that's problematic. Therefore, individuals should not be making policy through sovereign referenda. The second one is uninformed opinions. As societies evolve, they become more specialized and subsequently more complex. They accomplish this through delegating tasks. That some people are going to be farmers, some people are going to be doctors, others are going to be politicians, so they educate themselves on the issues. As a result, most people have limited expertise in national and global affairs because they're specialized to do other tasks. Moving on to misinformed opinions. The widespread availability of information makes it impossible to ensure that individuals are receiving true and accurate information. As such, people are subject to misinformation and propaganda. Go ahead.
Okay, talking about uninformed people who are going to vote, don't you believe that first of all, when it comes to such an important issue, they will actually know the real situation in their country, so they will know.
We think that the politicians also know what's going on in their country. We think that's why we have politicians, because they know and they're responsible to their electorate. Furthermore, we're going to continue how we're talking about misinformation and propaganda. We give you the example of how Muslims wanted to build a mosque near Ground Zero, and they were portrayed as terrorist sympathizers by Fox News, which dramatically swayed public opinion. But when independent fact-checkers looked into this to verify it, it turned out to be false. So we think that the swaying of public opinion is affected by private corporations, and we don't see a remedy to this on side proposition today. Okay, moving on to accountability. We see that politicians are more effective policymakers because they have a degree of accountability to the public through elections. We see that this not only happens through elections, but also constitutional courts, royal assent, and other mechanisms. So what we see is that like individuals do not have the same accountability. When individuals vote for racist policy like they did during a sovereign referenda in Switzerland where they banned minarets, we think that that's a problem and they don't have that accountability. We think that that accountability doesn't exist under their model, and we think that's the difference between politicians and individuals. So we've gone over how politicians make more qualified decisions. Now let's move into the beauty of democracy. First, we have three subpoints under this. Firstly, the plan, how policies must fit together. Secondly, the tyranny of the majority. And thirdly, compromise and compromise. Okay, so into the first idea, talking about how policies must fit together. We think that contrary to popular belief, having distinct parties does not satisfy every whim of constituents is a good thing. Because we think that this is, a commonly noted flaw with the democratic system is that parties provide an undesired package deal. The issue is that no party adequately satisfies every political, social, legal, economic, etc. view that they represent. However, this is done as a good reason, because of the intricate and interconnected different policies. We think that, for instance, while an individual may require an increase of quality social services, they also want a decrease of taxes. We think that those don't work together, that's why we have politicians. Moving into the tyranny of the majority. We said that, first of all, intra-party or intra-party compromise, so like within a party. We see that the abilities of MPs to conform to policy or party lines is a good thing, because we think it's the first step in the process of democracy coming towards a good solution. Inter-party compromise. We see that another critique of status quo is that individuals sacrifice their party views to conform to other parties. We think that this gives these parties, like these minorities, the ability to compromise with majority parties to have their interests heard. Furthermore, compromise and compromise. We see that if this motion passes, the quality of political debate will be lost, because debate is much easier between a few hundred MPs rather than millions of people. We think that the majority exceeds the minority, the minority isn't heard under this situation. So because politicians are more qualified and because of the beauty of democracy, we beg to oppose. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's now my pleasure to invite Maria. I'm sorry if that's mispronounced.
Maria.
Maria, that's okay. Right. Yeah.
Okay, honorable judges and opposition. Today debating about actually parliamentary democracy, knowing that it's one of the types of representative democracy, I'm actually trying to say how with referenda we're going to have a best mixture in representative democracy in order to hear voice of the people. Because what we do believe is the core and the best thing about democracy is that actually we are giving a chance to hear people's voice and to accomplish best their needs and their interests. So what we believe that certain democracies sometimes fail to do. Even though we have representatives, people vote for representatives in a certain parliament, but on the other side, they often fail to represent all of the people's interests and to fail what actually the majority in certain country wants. And that's why here we are facing a problem where the government is not working within the people's interests. And this is why we believe that democracy has such, for one of the most powerful democratic tools, the referendum. This is why we believe that actually the right of referendum is even put in the constitution to deal with important issues. So what actually the proposition said today is, first of all, that actually the citizens can be easily manipulated. Okay, I'm not saying that there is not a chance that a certain manipulative campaign will appear, but let's see what's actually the interest of the government if they put a referendum. If they put a referendum, that means that they want to hear the people. No, thank you. They want to hear the voice of the people. Their interest is what they think. No, thank you. They want their opinion in order to create a certain policy. So why would they be manipulative if they actually want the real, if they actually want the real opinion of the people in order to actually, in order to improve their work. Yes?
The real motivation behind politicians is to get their bills passed. Don't they have the motivation to do whatever it takes in order to get their specific agendas
Okay,
carried
thank
through?
you. If they want to do whatever, if actually their interest, politician interest, is to accomplish only their needs, they wouldn't even put the referendum on important issues. They would be agreeing them on itself. But when you, for example, have a referendum being, when you have actually a referendum in a certain democracy, in a certain country, this means that the country is interested in the voice of the people. And what the opposition was forgetting all along, saying that they are they might be manipulated, that they might not be actually well, that they might not have the knowledge that is required to vote on this referendum. They all along forget that actually the core of democracy is to hear what the people means. So democracy is created according to people's interests. And no matter what, the government, even if they want to be on some level manipulative, they will try to get the people's voice. Because if they not, if the referendum fails, what's actually what's actually the whole purpose of creating a certain referendum? Further on, they said, also referring to the manipulator, that the government will fund them, so we can't expect that we are going to have a neutral campaigns before the referendum. But as I explained before in my speech, the government is interested in the people's voice. Otherwise, there wouldn't be referendum put there. They further on said that that the one who are no thank you. They further on said that the one that don't want to get educated about a certain problem are still going to vote. Well, first of all, the one who are when it comes to important things, we can't expect that we should split the people who are educated and who can understand the complexity of the problem to vote and not. For example, when we have a constitutional change, we can't split the treaty workers and the people who have, who have been to university, because this is a certain problem that actually influences all the people of a certain country. So we can't expect to split them by the status in the society and let one vote and the other. This is why we're going to try to actually explain the problem. Nevertheless, how complex it is to all of the people, so we can have so we can accomplish the interest of all the people. Nevertheless, the status that they have in a certain society. Further on, they said going on to their arguments, they said that the best decisions aren't the ones that are the most popular. Yeah, I agree with this, but actually the most popular decision must be decided through referendums. Why? Because the most popular decisions that are made, those are such a significant changes that are made in a certain society, can be decided only by the politicians who they actually said that are often manipulated, can be actually decided only by them. We often, as they said, no thank you. So this is because politicians often fail to represent what the real people interests are. So this is why we believe that when it comes to important issues, we must use referendums. And when we don't have such an important issues as the motion states, we're not going to use referendum. We are going to use another democratic tool to solve these problems. What also they stated is that the politicians know best. The politicians know best, but this is actually failing the main value, the main principle of the democracy. Although they are choosing the representatives in the parliament, we can't state no thank you that they will never fail the citizens' interest, because as they said, people who might vote on the referendum have self-interest, and this is, I believe, truly legitimacy, because, for example, when we have a certain representative in the parliament, this representative can represent all of the people who voted for him in the parliament. Of course, that these certain people have different self-interest, and this is why we are giving them the referendum as a tool to express the self-interest if the representative in their parliament failed to represent it, although they voted for him on the election. Further on. No, thank you. Further on, what they mentioned was actually the majority. They said that minority often will vote for majority. They will often vote for majority issues just in order to clearly, I didn't understand this point. Okay, thank you. You can explain it to me.
Okay, so the point was that the minority groups can compromise with the majority to have their voices heard within Parliament, but that doesn't happen when everyone's voting on the issue.
Okay, thank you. Well, I don't see a problem. Yeah, if you're referring to the things that are happening in the parliament where we have majority and minority. First of all, when a certain issue is being put on the referenda, I'm sure that the people who are representing the minority will make sure that it's fair enough, and it will actually be fair enough for the majority and for the minority. No, and on the other side. Yes, we always have problems when it comes to majority and minority in a certain society. Majority, yes, overvotes the minority. This happens on election. This happens all the time. But this doesn't mean that we should not put the referenda, because even if the majority voice is only heard on the referendum, we still should stick with that, because that's how democracy works. That's how actually the principle of democracy are. That the majority are going to overvote on the minority. Yes, I do agree that maybe in some cases when majority and the minority are cooperating in the parliament is going to be a better solution for certain problems that are influencing the minorities. But we can actually not let this stop us into implementing referendums when it comes to important issues that are going to influence all the society, all the people in a certain society. Further on, what actually they finished their speech with was that we must leave the power in the hands of the politicians, no matter how manipulated they are, no matter how time they can fail to represent the people. No, we don't agree with this. On the other side, what we're saying as a last argument is that with referendum, we are giving the chance to the people to actually do monitoring of the system. How is this so? People will the government will have feedback from the people, and the feedback will have feedback from the government. And with this cooperation that referendums are offering us, we strictly believe that the referendum should be implemented on important issues in every parliamentary democracy. Thank you.
Right, okay, thank you very much. It's now my responsibility to call on Ryan, it's a straightforward name, I can spell that, to present the second argumentation for electors.
So far in this debate, side proposition has presented sort of a confusing front. A side that says they're in favor of democracy and the will of the people, and is going to do that by allowing politicians to call a referendum for the people on all important issues. But what they fail to understand, really, is that not only is their system one that won't really ever be utilized, which is something I'm going to be getting to in my speech, but one that, when utilized, is going to be incredibly harmful. Furthermore, one that, by its very nature and by its very existence, is going to cause disenfranchisement and problems in the parliamentary system. I'm going to be addressing all of these things in my speech today. Before I get into my final point, in which I talk about the involvement of the people and voter turnout, I'm going to be getting into some refutation of exactly what we heard come out of side proposition. Now, we heard really two main points come out of side proposition, both raised by their first speaker. Firstly, there was this idea of the power of democracy, and really the freedom of choice of the people to express their opinions. What we didn't hear come out in this point was really a reason why this freedom is always a good thing. We didn't hear a reason why the people, when their views can be so disruptive and cause so much damage, as we talked to you about throughout our entire case, why this is a good thing to enforce. Furthermore, we show you that we generally do limit freedom of choice in parliamentary democracies, in all kinds of governments, if it can be harmful to the government, or if it can be harmful to the society. We don't think that the people know best, and we think that the freedom that they do deserve by virtue of being a democracy is given to them perfectly by the electoral system. They have the freedom to vote for the party and for the line of policy that they agree with. And so, and in fact, what I'm going to go on to prove is that having these referendums actually hurts this process of voting. So they went to talk about this idea of education and interest, that people are going to become more educated by listening to these decisions. And again, we don't think this is true. Firstly, we think that if politicians do call these referenda, the reason they might do so is in order to basically brainwash the public, because governments rely a lot on propaganda. Later in my speech, I'm going to be getting to the example of Russia, but it's a good point to bring up now. Not all parliamentary democracies run perfectly smoothly. A lot of times, they use the government and they use the people to further their own agenda. So when these referenda are called, they can be used to spread misinformation or spread biased opinions on the government. And so people don't get the full side. In fact, by calling these referendums, they get worse information than they would have otherwise. But going on to the second idea they brought up about, basically they talked about two things. Firstly, how this engages the voters. I'm actually going to address this directly in my constructive case, but suffice it to say, in the three main reasons why voter turnout happens, which are obstacles, apathy, and perception. This is actually worse for all of these. Then they talked about this issue of solving political problems and how the governments can call on the people in order to create problems. But what they don't realize is, well, basically all of the problems that we've talked about. What this does is create more problems. What if Greece decided to get out of the EU? What if any country decided to abolish its native treaties because they felt that those were harmful to the country? These can be devastating social and political situations within a country, and side proposition has ignored the damage that these will in fact cause. So now I'd like to get into some rebuilding of what my partner talked about, since the second proposition speaker basically spent her case revolving around the refutation of our opposition case. So the first point that Brittany raised was this idea of qualification, of who is the most qualified to make decisions. Clearly, we've said it's the people, and we brought up many reasons why. And these reasons weren't so much contested as the idea that, well, people will be interested in what the politicians, rather, will be interested in what the people have to say. And this is where I'd really like to address this whole issue of the practicality of this debate. Because firstly, we don't think this is true. We don't think that politicians go into government with the purpose of saying, oh yeah, I'm going to carry on the great tradition of democracy. Well, we think democracy is a good thing. We think it works because politicians have ideas, politicians have a plan, and they're going to stop at nothing to follow through with it. So whether it's right for the country or not, they are the ones who have the most knowledge. They're the ones who have the best ideas on these topics. And so they aren't going to call referenda because they don't want their party line or their party politics to be disrupted with. And moreover, the fact that they exist are actually harmful to the voting system, harmful to safe information, as I've already talked about, and harmful to voter engagement, which I'm going to talk about. And then the second idea that she talked about was this issue of the beauty of democracy. This idea of, well, we brought up a number of ideas, basically dealing with the majority versus the minority. The fact that in a parliamentary democracy, you have a lot of different voices heard by virtue of having a lot of different policies. And what side proposition ignored was that a referenda is yes or no. I say I agree with this or I don't agree with this. There is no middle ground. And so by virtue of not having the spectrum of ideas, which is basically what democracy is about, they're ignoring these views. If you have politicians call these referendums, then what you do is, rather than having compromise, which is what democracy is based around, the idea of you compromise and together we come to find the best solution, what you have is yes or no. You have extremism, and that's not how democracy functions. Now I'd like to address your point.
Yeah, well, actually, referendum being a yes or no answered question, I guess it refers to the thing that certain policies actually will be implemented or won't be implemented in
yeah,
certain
but this
countries.
isn't how it works in a normal parliamentary democracy. You have compromise. It's not just, oh, I want this budget or I want that budget. It's not, I want this program or I don't want it. It's, let's come to a consensus. Let's see, maybe we want to spend more on this sector, but take away on this sector. And it's these variety of viewpoints that we're missing out with referenda, and that's the reason why parliamentary democracies are as great as they are. So, getting into that, I'd like to address this much alluded to points that I've said without my speech, and that is actually why the existence of referenda in and of themselves are harmful to the voting process. And this is also where I'll be addressing this idea of voter turnout. So in general, both sides can agree that the line on side proposition has been a more democratic system, more power to the people. And while we don't necessarily think that giving the people such absolute control is a good thing, we also think that in terms of voter turnout and engagement in ordinary elections, this is harmful. Why? Well, let's take a look right now at the current problem. On average, parliamentary democracies have a voter turnout of around 60%, although it varies by country and varies by election. Now, we think 60% and realize that this is a fairly low number. And the fact that this is a fairly low number is in itself a bad thing, because that's not representative of what the people want. For example, in Greece's most recent election, only 62.5% of the people voted. while the majority party only had around 30% of the vote in the end. This election could have been much changed had the remaining 40% actually voted in the election. In US midterm elections, the voter turnout is routinely less than 50%, which really means that the decision isn't democratic at all, since half of the people aren't even voting on the issues. And this is actually exacerbated by the lines of demographics. In the US, people, and among groups who make over $75,000 a year, 86% vote. People who make less than $15,000 a year, 52% vote. These are seriously exacerbated by demographics, which also skews the issues. So, why do referenda decrease voter turnout? Well, there are 3 reasons why this happens. Obstacles. Firstly, people don't vote if it's inconvenient for them to do so. In fact, in less stable states, they can be interrupted by violence, as we've seen in Russia's most recent presidential elections, as we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan, in their recent parliamentary democracies. So, by increasing the number of votes, we necessarily increase the obstacles. Furthermore, apathy. We see that people, if there are so many more issues, will become disenfranchised because there are so many and less likely to choose. And lastly, the idea of perception, that whether or not you vote is dependent on how you see the issues. So in all of these cases, having more votes does not mean more voter engagement. What we need is a more stable democracy with more reasonable voting limits. This isn't achieved by the resolution. This resolution must fall.
Just hang on a minute, please. Right, thank you very much. It's now my responsibility to call to present the final speech on the affirmative side.
Thank you very much. So today we live in a democratic society. The main thing that the opposition forgot was that democratic society means the ruling of the people. The people are the ones who rule the society. So the voice of the people has to be heard. Referendum is the only way to be heard. Because in this way, referendums are the one thing that that is monitoring the system when there's a 4-year time between the elections. So in these 4 years, the people are going to have to make something like referendums in order to be heard, and the referendums are the only way. So now I'm going to refer to my case. First I'm going to refute their refutations, and then I'm going to refer to the case. They said the power of democracy is not going to be set aside by the referendums, but this is not true. They said that the referendums doesn't provide the freedom. Yes, the referendums are here to provide the freedom of choice, because not always the people can be heard, and not always the people are the ones who are willing to who are capable to be heard. And also they have no thank you. And also they keep talking that the people are not capable enough to make decisions, but in these cases politicians are also people. No, thank you. The politicians are people, and they do. The politicians come from people. Because no, thank you. Because the main thing is that these issues are so big, and the politicians are making sure that the normal people will understand these issues, and this is why they are asking them in yes or no questions, because they simplify the issue in order to be understood by every single person in the state. Then they talk about the education and about the brainwashing, but they keep forgetting that there is government, but there is also opposition, and they are the people who, and there are all the people who are capable enough to make a decision, and who will listen to both propagandas. Maybe yes, there is propaganda, but there are two propagandas. They will always make they will be the ones who will decide that. Yes, please.
So. Yes, there's always going to be minorities, but at least under the status quo, these minority parties are heard by majority parties, whereas minorities aren't heard by the majority.
Let me say you about something about this. Well, yes, I do agree that there are minorities and majorities, but also in democracy, the best thing for democracy bases on what is the best for the majority, what is the best for the whole country. So yes, maybe there are minorities who are not going to be satisfied, but the main thing is to the main thing of this is of democracy is satisfaction for the majority of the people. Yes, there will be minorities who will be dissatisfied, but this percentage is very low compared to no thank you. I'm just answering your question. Now I'm going to continue to my arguments, to further refutations. They also say that they do need older people need qualifications, and the older people need qualifications in order to understand the issue. But no, then they also said that the politicians have qualifications, and they have wasted their life in education and something like that and they are capable to make these decisions. But today we are speaking about decisions that are too big to be discussed just by the politicians. In these times we have to hear the voice of the people. As I said before, the people are capable enough to make decisions that are explained on yes or no level. Because in this, no thank you. Because in this way, because on referendums the issues are so big, and that way they are explained on a simplified level. They talked about the beauty of democracy and the minority and majority, and also they said about the yes or no thing that I also referred now, and that was the POI point. Yes, there will always be minorities and majorities, but the democracy is made for democracy is that kind of constitution that is stated for by itself. It means that the majorities are going to be the one who are going to be overvoted by the overvoting the minorities. But the main thing is that the majorities will be satisfied, and this is why the state is going to be is going to have better income in the future, because they're not going to be a dissatisfaction of the majority. Then they told about the compromise. That the referendums don't mean compromise, but yes, the referendums are the one thing that means compromise. It is the compromising between the people and the government. So referendums are here to make a compromise, to make a more, as my teammate said, referendums are here to make a monitoring of the system that is in 4 years' time, and that's the government. Because yes, I do agree that politicians are good, but not all politicians care about the state. Maybe there are a lot of politicians that are manipulative, and in these ways we can monitor the system and we can check. Yes.
Oh, okay. So aren't you aware that politicians are literally not only paid to be researching these facts, but are subdivided into committees to research the motions in front of them?
Well, yes, I do believe that the politicians are paid, but in these situations, there are a lot of politicians that will, they will simply won't care about the people's opinion, because they are going to be selfish enough, and this is a common daily basis, and we are all aware of that. That the politicians are they are good politicians, but there are also manipulative politicians who won't care about this issue, and they will put themselves before the others. And they also about. Yes, they also said the parliamentary democracy, and on the elections there is a low income of people that are going in elections. And they said the Greece case. But also these elections, people don't go to elections because they do know that on the elections they can't express their thinking. They can't. Emotions are a thing that elections are a thing that you are going to choose a person and not say your going to say your own opinion. No, thank you. And also on referendums, we are going to have a higher percentage of people that are going to go out and vote, because this issue is important. And no, thank you. This issue is so important, and all the people are going to go to referendums because they do want to participate in the decision, which is going to be actually very important for their lives. Yes.
Can you please engage with the issue that more obstacles are inherent in more voting, and more apathy over a large number of issues are inherent, leading to less voter turnout?
Well, they deal with the issue with the elections, but not with referendums, because referendums are here referendums are just of big issues, and just in times when you do need monitoring from the people, and also referendums are things that are not that frequent as elections. So now I'm going to refer to my case. We had two arguments. The one was called the power of democracy, and the second argument was called uniting the parties, and the third argument was called monitoring the system. So basically all they did was they tried to refute arguments, but the refutations were pretty efficient because they kept forgetting, as I said before, that democracy means ruling of the people. That is the main thing about democracy, that the people's voice has to be heard. And also, they also forget that the people are not that. Sorry for saying this, but dumb to don't understand the basic thing about. They don't understand the issue or that is an issue that is affecting them all. The second argument was the second argument was monitoring of the system. This argument was very important because this way because by monitoring the system by monitoring the system we are going to show how if the government are efficient or not efficient maybe in 4 years time. Thank you.
My pleasure to invite Naira, I'm sorry that's mispronounced, to present the third negative case.
What we saw today was a side proposition with admirable intentions towards an impossible goal. What they want to do is try and improve our democratic process while trying to shut out minority votes at the same time and lower the quality of debate and discourse within politics. As well, at the same time, what we saw from them was a failure to show how voter turnout and voter involvement and the actual role of the people is going to be improved under their model. And what I'm going to do for you today is show why side opposition is obviously winning in this debate through two main themes. Firstly, the purpose of democracy, and secondly, this idea of efficacy. So, let's get into the first theme, that of purpose of democracy. And under this, we're going to talk about two things. Firstly, about the role of the people, and secondly, about the role of politicians and parties. So, on to the role of the people. Now, what we saw from side proposition under this point was this idea that we must always try and hear the voice of the people, no matter what the cost. And the more voices, the better. And they oftentimes try to say that the people are the core of democracy, and we would agree with that. However, we don't think that any group of people have the right to outweigh the power of other people within the political process. Because what we see is the beauty of democracy under the status quo is that you can elect different representatives, and although there are majority parties and minority parties, what we see is they are all forced to engage with each other in discourse. They're all forced to engage in debate, and it's sad to see that today we haven't seen that debate is an important thing on side proposition. What we've seen today is a side that ignores the fact that under their model, the minority vote will simply no longer count. They haven't showed any room for this idea of amendments. They didn't talk about this. They didn't show how minorities will actually be able to engage in discussion because they simply can't. Because what we think is it's easier to engage in discussion between a few hundred MPs versus a few million people within your society. So even furthermore, what they talked about, what they talked about was this idea of the role of the people is going to be improved because somehow voter turnout is going to go up. And I'm going to talk about this more a little later on. However, what we see is that it isn't actually going up. If anything, what we see is that it's stagnant and very low. And in one case of, where actually sovereign referenda exists, such as Switzerland, it's actually below 50%. So the people's view isn't actually being heard on a principled level. Now, furthermore, what they talked about was this idea of, but what we showed you on side proposition under this was this idea of qualifications. What we showed you is that people aren't necessarily qualified to run a country. What we think is that they are qualified to form a decision in order to decide which sort of avenue they want to go down. That's why parties have sort of party lines. That's why they have platforms, to try and engage in society on a level that they are willing to understand. Because what we see is that politics is actually a career. What we think is that in order to have a qualified opinion, say, on Obamacare in the United States, you have to be willing to read 1,400 pages of Obamacare. And we see under the status quo, we turn books into movies for a reason. No one has the time to read these things. No one has the time to get involved in this process because we think that when it comes to qualifications, the people aren't qualified to do this, and we think that that's okay because we are willing to leave them what they are qualified for, which is being able to vote for representatives within democracy.
Wait a minute.
Yes.
So if you're saying that people are not qualified enough to vote on a referendum, don't you actually address the same thing when it comes to election? Don't you mean that? Do you
no, because what we see is that they're voting for people. They're voting for parties who are then accountable to them, and I'm going to get into this more later on, but they're voting for parties who are held accountable to them. And like we talked about under this idea of self-interest in our first argument, was that people are only held accountable to themselves under this model. What we see is that if they do elect a politician, and the politician is misleading, then they lose their job. Because they are held accountable to their constituents. So we think that that's an important role that politicians play. Now, even further, and so on to the second idea, the role of politicians and parties. So what side proposition tried to sell to you was this idea that politicians are out to get their constituents, that they are all manipulative. And while this may be debatable, what we see is that that's not actually what they are out to do. What we think is that even if this was, first of all, this is a contradiction because they are still influential under their model, because they still get to make this legislation, they still initiate this legislation, they're still elected by political parties, and nothing's stopping them from trying to sway the population during times of referenda. So what we see is that they still have this sort of idea. But even now, under this model, manipulation and corruption is more imminent because of the fact that they now have to convince people rather than other parties to side with them, because now it's ultimately up to the people. So now all it takes really is this sort of media influence that they already have, that already sways elections as it is. And we think that putting more power into that is ultimately dangerous in preserving the fundamentals of democracy. Now, even furthermore, what we showed you on side opposition today was that at least politicians and parties are allowed to facilitate debate. We think that that's a major issue in this debate that side proposition needs to engage with. So on to this idea of efficacy. What we see once again are two themes. Firstly, this idea of the political process, and secondly, this idea of voter turnout. So under this idea of political process, what we saw from side proposition was basically one thing, that it's going to resolve political problems, and they talked about this in their first speech. What we say is that when parties disagree, we think that may be a good thing, because it shows that not everyone thinks alike. We don't want to paint this sort of picture under referenda where the majority ultimately rules, because what we think is that you have to be able to facilitate debate, but even more importantly, having these different viewpoints is a good thing. It's because of that. No, thank you. Because of that, we have more representation. We think that that's more effective in terms of trying to achieve representation, which once again is one of the purposes of democracy. Thank you. Now, even further, what we see is this a problem because of the fact that it hinders an already inefficient process. Because what we see is a problem with democracy that many people find is the fact that it's very inefficient. But we think that by putting more steps in order to try and pass legislation is simply going to make it more inefficient. And we think that delaying this sort of political process, delaying what may control people's lives, is denying them to what they truly deserve, which is an effective government. Now, secondly, this idea of voter turnout. And even furthermore, this last one was this idea of cost, which is because of the fact that elections already cost a lot. We think that referenda is only going to add to this. Side proposition showed no way to actually control this idea of frequency under their model. So we think that once again, the cost is anyone's guess of how much it may be. Now, on to this idea of voter turnout. So what we saw from side opposition firstly was this idea of information and education under their model, which somehow translates to the idea that voter turnout is going to increase because people are going to be more aware. Well, firstly, under their model, they're not forcing awareness, they're just making it available. And we think that news outlets are already available to people, that people are still choosing not to vote. They're not taking the opportunities that they've already been given. Now, thank you. So we say is that, once again, we don't think that this is going to be very effective. If anything, we see the fact that lots of people choose not to vote because of its inconvenience. So we think that by adding more obstacles, by adding more avenues for them to go down, and adding more elections, we think that if anything, voter turnout may decrease because of the fact that lots of people see it as an inconvenience, and lots of people just seem apathetic to things that are simply inconvenient to them. So even
on that point, ma'am.
And actually, sure.
Okay, so talking about the inconvenience of the system, yeah, you actually are showing us that the politicians are inconvenient, and that's why people don't go out of the election. But when we're actually giving the power to decide directly to the people, don't you believe that the
No, when you give this power directly to the people, first of all, you're shutting out a huge portion of the people, because now the people who may have been represented by minority parties are now simply cut off from the political system completely. So we think that that's both principally and practically harmful to democracy. And more importantly, what we see is that if anything, it is making it more inefficient because of the fact that the people now have another step within the democratic process, which they haven't been involved with in the past enough to earn this sort of idea, to think and for side proposition to assume that they are going to take this responsibility with the importance that it has. Now, furthermore, what we talked about was this idea of weak democracies under our last argument, which is this idea that in developing democracies, we don't think that many of them are able to sort of support this referendum, because lots of times we see the problem is that the government doesn't have enough legitimacy, that the government doesn't have enough control. So we think that by trying to push for this idea of having sort of more minorities be able to vote, we think that's inherently a bad thing. Not only that, but we also see this issue of, say, misinformation or being simply uninformed, and we see those as fundamental flaws. And it's because of this that we saw on-site opposition proudly opposed.
Well, hang on a sec, please. It's now my pleasure to invite Brittany to present the negative factors and throw her pen on the floor.
Over the last 2 years, we saw the Arab Spring, where people in the Arab world were willing to fight and die for democracy because it works so well in the status quo. And what we see as proposition is damaging the effects and the effectiveness of democracy, and that's what we're contending with today. So we want to tell you why on a principle and both a practical level, we think that sovereign referenda are harmful towards a country, and we'll show you why we've won the debate in doing so. So now let's move on to the principle level. We found that there were two main issues of contention under the principle. Firstly, the goals of democracy, and secondly, politicians and their role. So under this idea of the goals of democracy, side proposition came up here and told us that the goals of democracy were to have the majority rule, and that's what democracy was all about. Firstly, we told you that majority should rule in elections, but minorities should be heard in other forms, such as in parliament, lobbying, etc. Furthermore, we think that the goal of democracy is to make the best decision for the people, which is accomplished through the beauty of democracy, as we explained, where the politicians have the ability to take other people's interests, minorities' interests, into account. We think that creates the greatest good. Furthermore, they told us that even if the minority isn't satisfied, it's okay. We think that that's wrong because we think that this leads to things like the oppression of racial minorities, for example, the Kurds in Iraq, or the Kurdish people in Iraq. We think that that's problematic. We didn't see proposition justify to us why it's okay to oppress minorities and why we always want the majority to win in democratic elections. We think that's problematic. Moving on to the idea of politicians, we think this was also contentious. They told us that politicians put themselves before others and are easily manipulated. But we told you that politicians are more qualified because they engage in the material and research as it is a part of their job. Furthermore, we said that they're more qualified because they're forced to engage in debate within the parliaments. We think that's good for creating a greater awareness, creating a greater understanding. Furthermore, we think that these politicians are exposed to multiple but non-binding views. So, for example, lobbying and petitions. So what we see is what side proposition is telling us is that we should implement referenda which are binding and have legal implications and they're automatically passed. We think that's problematic. We think that politicians should be hearing the voice of the people, but not when the voice of the people trump the voice of the politicians. Furthermore, we talked to you about how politicians have accountability under constitutional courts, but people do not. And we gave you the example of the minarets within Switzerland, and we never heard that contended on side proposition today. So we think that on the principal grounds we've won this debate, but moving on to the practical, we think that the main issue of contention was engagement and how this is going to affect voter engagement. They told us that people will be more engaged through referenda because it's pertinent issues. What we told you is that in practical terms it actually doesn't play out in real life. We gave you the example of Switzerland where they have sovereign referendums about 4 times a year. Essentially what we saw is that there's a 46% average voter turnout in Switzerland, which is lower than the 60% voter turnout in average in democracies in general. We think that doesn't actually play out in practice. Furthermore, we talked to you about the obstacles, apathy, and perception that affect voter turnout and how that's the actual reason why people don't turn out when you have more elections. Furthermore, they told us that they will because referenda aren't as frequent as elections. We say that this is a concession that their resolution won't actually do anything, that it's not going to be used ever. And furthermore, we'd say that when it is, it's in addition to elections. So this point doesn't actually stand because there's still going to be that problem of people just don't want to get out and vote. So the problem is, So on a practical level, what we see is that engagement actually isn't increased under their model. We think that engagement is better increased when we look towards politicians who are going to make good, responsible choices for our people, for our world, and for the minorities. On these grounds, we absolutely beg to oppose. Thank you.
It's my pleasure now to invite the negative replies, the affirmative replies from Mara and Maya.
Okay. So, honorable judges and opposition, I'm going to actually start my case the same way that the previous speaker started me, with the Arab Spring. Yeah, I do agree that people would die for democracy. But also on the other side, I would actually mention the riots in Britain or the Wall Street. What does this show us? That sometimes, even though democracy claims to be one of the best systems in the world, can fail. And why can democracy actually fail? Because of the lack of the cooperation between the government and the citizens. So what is actually the solution to this problem? What is actually the proposition saying here today? It's that the best solution is referendum. The second name for referendum is actually a direct democracy. Why is this so? Because you give actually the people the right to direct impact the society and to direct impact the decisions and the choices, actually the decisions and the things that will be implemented by the government. These things without referendum will actually usually fails to be accomplished. And this is why we have the examples of a lot of riots, a lot of protests when the government, actually the people who voted the government trusted it in that moment, but further on the government, just because we have 4 years of ruling the same government, fails to represent them the best and fails to accomplish their interests. So this is why we believe that we should by any chance force the best tool of the people that can be given to the people in a certain democracy to express their voice, and the best tool that can be given to the government to always check whether they're doing the right job and whether they're implementing the right things and accomplishing the interests of its citizens. So what actually the opposition today had was certain contradictories in their statements. First of all, they said that we have manipulative politicians who do manipulative propaganda and campaigns. But on the other side as well, they say that we still should give this power only to the politician and not to the people. So this means that we are going to have this manipulative politicians who actually are always turn to their self-interest to rule the people, to create all the policies and to make all the choices in certain country. And on the other side, we won't give the people by any chance have any tool to actually fix this government work and to show it that they're not satisfied with what it is doing. Further on, they said that they believe in the non-referendum system, saying that the electional system is just fine. But on the other side, they said that we have apathy and small turnout when we have elections. Why is this so? As we explained before in our speeches, this is just because the people don't believe that by certainly electing a representative in the parliament, their voices will be represented and their interests will be accomplished. So this is why we, as I said before, are giving them the tool of direct democracy, direct choosing what they want to be implemented in their country and direct deciding. So we believe that actually what referendum is a perfect way of cooperation between the government and the citizens. Why? Because the government actually creates the policy, unless what the opposition said that actually we are not giving the chance to the people we are not giving the chance to the government to discuss this and to debate on this motion. No, it's a perfect mixture and it's a perfect cooperation. We are giving the chance to the politicians who are paid for that to discuss on these things, to debate, to locate the problem, and then we are giving the chance to the people to approve this thing. This is why I believe that referendum is a perfect cooperation relations between these between the government and the citizens. So they mentioned the example with Switzerland and the small turnout. But on the other side, I'm going to mention two examples from our area. The first one was choosing the independence in Macedonia and then choosing the independence in Montenegro. These two referendums turned out to be voted by 70%, more than 70% from the people in this area. So why would we have such a turnout? Because people care. People want to be participants of the government voice, and people want to of the government choice, and people want to decide what will be happening in the country. So we actually definitely can't imagine a picture where when the independence of my country is decided without my voice being given. So by having the perfect cooperation, I don't see any reason why we should not have the referenda to be voted for important issues.
Right, thank you very much to both teams. We need now to think about our decision. Can I just say one thing? I think you're a bit quick to go on to these. They have 30 seconds. Yeah, 30. So 8 minutes speech, and then it's all right, don't worry. But yeah, just for future. Apologise to them, not me. No, you're all right. Don't worry. You don't have to apologise to anyone. But just while I remember it, stick with it. Yeah. Okay. I won't be very long, but thank you very much.